Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Ronin Davis, and I am a project manager at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before we begin, I have a couple of technical notes. If you encounter connection or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. So we'll also post that number to the chat box on your screen. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues we may not be able to resolve during the webinar. However, we are recording today's webinar, and it will be posted on our website along with a copy of the slides used in today's presentation. So on today's webinar, we will review the application requirements for the Second Chance Act Comprehensive Community-Based Adult Reentry Program, or Community Reentry Grant. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A box on the bottom right corner of your screen. We will have time at the end of the webinar to address the questions you have submitted, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can before we conclude today. Joining me today is Andre Bethia, Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA, and my colleague, Jan Dela Cruz, a Policy Analyst here at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. At this time, I'm going to ask Andre to tell us a little bit about BJA before we go into telling you a little bit about the Justice Center and getting into the requirements of the grant. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andre.
Thanks, Ronin. And thank you all for joining us for this solicitation webinar. The Bureau of Justice Assistance. BJ helps to make American communities safer by strengthening the nation's criminal justice system. Its grants, training and technical assistance, and policy development services provide state, local, and tribal governments with the cutting-edge tools and best practices they need to reduce violence and drug-related crime, support law enforcement, and combat victimization. To learn more about BJA, visit us at www.bja.gov. Also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. BJA is part of the Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs. The Second Chance Act, which funds this particular opportunity, has supported over $300 million in reentry investments across the country. All right, Ronnie?
Thanks, Andre. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Council of State Governments Justice Center as we get started here. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. Staff here provide practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based, consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. Technical assistance for Second Chance Act grants is provided by the National Reentry Resource Center, which is administered by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and managed by the Justice Center, providing support to Second Chance Act grantees and the broader field. The NRRC has delivered technical assistance to over 800 Second Chance Act grant programs and provides individualized, intensive, and targeted technical assistance, training, and distance learning to support SCA grantees. The Resource Center is continually adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the background on the Second Chance Act. Passed in 2008, the Second Chance Act authorizes a variety of federal grant programs that support state and local governments, tribal entities, and nonprofit organizations in providing evidence-based services intended to reduce recidivism and promote public safety. This year, the Second Chance Act turns 10 years old and continues to support various reentry initiatives around the country. While Second Chance Act grants are often awarded to government agencies such as Departments of Corrections and Sheriff offices, the Department of Justice has awarded around $100 million to community and faith-based organizations to run reentry programs. These grants have been awarded to more than 206 nonprofit organizations and have included programs that focus on serving young adult parents, Latino and Latina youth, children and families of incarcerated parents, and reentry services where mentoring plays a critical role. Different organizations have used their grant funds to support reentry in a number of ways. Some past examples of community-based programs that have been funded under the Second Chance Act include WestCare Washington, which is focusing their program on veterans returning from incarceration and providing mentoring pre- and post-release. The Memphis Leadership Foundation has contracted with their Department of Corrections to fund 2 corrections employees to provide comprehensive case management and reentry transition planning. They are then connected to volunteer mentors to support their reentry post-release. Hope Network in West Michigan is using grant funds to focus on workforce development for men returning from incarceration. Case managers from Hope Network work with peer navigators from a partnering agency to address reentry needs. The 3 primary project partners meet bi-weekly to discuss participant progress and determine the best services and referrals to meet their population's needs. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Jan to provide an overview of this year's grant program.
Thanks, Rodine. This year, the SCA Community-Based Adult Reentry Grant provides an opportunity for applicants to apply under one of 2 categories. Category 1, Community-Based Adult Reentry, and Category 2, Community-Based Adult Reentry with small and rural organizations. I'll provide more information on each category in the next slide. You can view the full solicitation at BJA's funding website shown here on this slide. All applications are due May 1st, 2018. Regardless of which category you apply under, the grant consists of a 36-month performance period broken up into a planning period and implementation period. The starting date for the entire 36-month performance period is October 1st, 2018. For Category 1, BJA expects to grant up to 8 awards, each being up to $1 million. $200 are to be released to the grantee for the planning phase, and the remaining $800,000 will be released when the grantee enters the implementation phase of their program. Under Category 1, grantees will have to commit to serving at least 150 participants throughout the course of the grant. For Category 2, BJA expects to grant up to 4 awards up to $500,000 each. $100,000 to be awarded during the planning phase and the remaining $400,000 for the implementation. To qualify for Category 2, applicants must have an operating budget of no more than $1 million per year and cannot be a chapter or member affiliate of a larger national organization. The serving requirement for Category 2 is at least 75 participants. The goals and objectives of the grant is to support community and faith-based organizations in developing and implementing reentry programs that are comprehensive and collaborate and promote collaboration in an attempt to reduce recidivism of people returning to the community after a period of incarceration. Programs are to develop comprehensive case management plans that address criminogenic risk and needs and demonstrate increased collaboration between community-based organizations and corrections, community supervision, law enforcement, or any other reentry stakeholders. As previously mentioned, nonprofit and tribal nonprofit organizations are eligible, but also federally recognized Indian tribal governments as well. BJA welcomes applications that involve 2 or more entities that will carry out the funded federal award activities. However, one eligible entity must be the applicant, as in the grant manager and fiscal agent, and the other must be proposed as sub-recipients. For target population, programs should focus on adults who have been convicted as adults and are incarcerated at the time of program enrollment. And this is to mean incarcerated in a state, local, or tribal prison or jail. Programs should focus their services on those who are medium or high risk to reoffend as determined by a validated assessment tool. As for grant deliverables, applicants are to include in their proposal a timeline and plan for their planning phase of up to 12 months. There is also a Planning and Implementation Guide, or P&I Guide, that will serve as an action plan, a logic model, summary of strategies and intended outcomes, research base for proposed strategies, and details of the research/evaluation to be conducted. The P&I guide is to be completed in consultation with your NRC technical assistance provider. He or she will work closely with you to flesh out the proposed program in the guide. Grantees are to complete the P&I guide during the planning phase of the program and will not have access to the implementation funds until the guide is complete and submitted to BJA. Also important to note is that completion of the guide typically requires a collaborative effort by multiple parties involved in the program. Input from your evaluator, correctional partners, and different members of your program staff will likely need to be leveraged to adequately complete the guide. With that, I thank you all for your time and turn it back over to Andre.
Thanks, Jan. Let's get into the mandatory requirements. There are 9 mandatory requirements when developing a proposal for this grant. In your proposal, you must provide an estimated number of people that you plan to serve, or your target population, if you will. This number must meet the minimum requirement, and applicants must provide justification that demonstrates the will, in all likelihood, to have access to the number of people meeting the eligibility requirements. The footnote on page 8 of the solicitation provides more detail on what we're looking for in the justification and is different for proposals to continue existing programs versus proposals to develop new programs. Applicants should also provide a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, or Memorandum of Agreement, MOA, that demonstrates a partnership with the agency and facilities where the program will enroll participants. For example, if you're working with a state prison, provide documentation that shows buy-in from the prison facility and the State Department of Correction. MOUs should also be established with community corrections, probation, and parole. We're also asking applicants to include a MOU or a MOA with your local law enforcement agency or agencies. These memorandums of agreement or understanding with these partners should clearly specify the role of each organization. With law enforcement, we're looking for programs that are collaborating with law enforcement agencies to better support the reentry population. This may include bringing in officers to conduct training, having them take part on an advisory group or planning committee, or working together to provide early interventions to recently released program participants. While independent evaluation is a priority consideration, which I will discuss later, all applicants are expected to collaborate with an evaluation partner to assist in the development of the program outcomes, collecting and analyzing data, determining a baseline recidivism rate, and developing tools to monitor quality assurance. When developing your partnerships, whether they are through MOUs or MOAs, with corrections or more informal, please articulate your plan to engage with any partner that plays a crucial role in the program. This can include your treatment providers, your housing support services, social service agencies, etc. Engagement plans should discuss what level and frequency of communication you will have with the partner, how information will be shared amongst the entire planning group, and as always, please review the solicitation text for more details. Proposals must also include a description of how the program will integrate the risk and needs assessments. The lead agency can implement their own tool or utilize the results of a tool used by their correction partners. Either way, applicants should demonstrate how they'll use the risk and needs assessment to focus services on those with the highest need and develop case plans to meet those needs. Building on that, proposals should demonstrate how cognitive-based programming will play a role in the reentry process. This can include services directly provided by the lead agency or services provided by the correctional facility or a partner agency, and how that information is shared with the program. All applicants need to provide a baseline recidivism rate for their population. Recidivism definitions vary in different jurisdictions. Ensure this definition matches the definition you'll use to track recidivism of program participants, and is as representative of your target population as possible. Lastly, please include a plan to measure outcomes. This includes the outcome detailed in the solicitation that you will be required to report to BJA, as well as the outcomes that align with the goals of the program and the grant. Ensure they are clearly defined and measurable. As you develop your proposals, please keep in mind that priority will be given to those programs that incorporate one or more of the following considerations. In an effort to better address violence, programs may focus their services on individuals with violent offense convictions, either at the time of enrollment or in their past. While all applicants must collaborate with evaluators to assist in outcome development and other considerations, priority will be given to those programs that provide for an independent evaluation that includes a random assignment of people where feasible. Evaluation of programs is essential to determine which interventions are successful. Evaluation should detail clearly defined outcomes, including recidivism and other reentry outcomes such as sustained employment, long-term housing, improved family relationships, etc. The research partner can be an independent consultant or located in an academic institution, a state statistical analysis center, or a research organization. The research partner should have demonstrated expertise conducting the type of work proposed. Additional priority considerations include integrating feedback from law enforcement, victims of crime, and people who have been incarcerated and their families into the program design. Programs that plan to develop or have existing relationships with local reentry task force or councils. And the last consideration is specific to those eligible to apply under Category 2. This is for the programs that plan to operate out of a rural area of the country and serve a population returning to a rural community. Beyond what is required, there's a wide variety of allowable uses under this grant. Key to any reentry program is the utilization of criminogenic risk and needs information and case planning and management in the community. Programs should explore how they will be providing a comprehensive range of services that may include any of the services or programs listed on the slide, such as vocational training, housing support, and trauma-informed care. While these funds may be used to implement programs that incorporate services like mentoring, job readiness, and employability, and civil legal aid, it is important to note that funds may not be used to pay or subsidize participant wages or cover the cost of direct representation in litigation. Here on this slide, you'll find the review criteria for grant applications. A full list of requirements can be found in the solicitation. Thank you again for all participating in this webinar, and I want to turn it over back to Roneen, who will provide further information.
Thanks, Andre. So I know that was a lot of information for folks to take in. I do want to remind you that the PowerPoint slides from this presentation, as well as a recording of the presentation, will be available on our website. And I do encourage everyone to review the actual solicitation, as Andre mentioned, during his portion, to make sure to catch any of the details of the details that we've been covering. There's a lot more detail in the actual solicitation.
So, and I think they're wrapping up right now.
Sorry about that. I think we have someone who's not on mute, so we'll try and go ahead and address that, but I'll go ahead and continue. Here are some important contacts to be aware of when applying for this grant. If you need technical assistance when submitting the application, please contact the grants.gov customer support hotline, which is provided here on this slide. The phone line and email are available 24/7, at 1-800-518-4726 or support@grants.gov. So they're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and this is specifically with filling out the application if you're having any technical difficulties. If you need assistance with any other requirements of the solicitation, please contact the National Criminal Justice Reference Service Response Center, NCJRS. Their hours of operation are listed on this slide, and they can be contacted at 1-800-851-3420 or at grants@ncjrs.gov. Their hours are 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, but on the date that the solicitation closes, so May 1st when it's due, they're open till 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We also wanted to provide some additional resources that may be helpful when designing the program for your proposal. Each of the sites listed on this slide provide information on different evidence-based programs and practices. The National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, or NREP, is run by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. CrimeSolutions.gov is a repository run by the Office of Justice Programs and serves as a central resource to help practitioners and policymakers understand what works in justice-related programs and practices. The What Works in Reentry Clearinghouse is a one-stop shop for research on the effectiveness of a wide variety of reentry programs and practices. Here you'll find contact information for Andre Bethia, Jan Dela Cruz, and myself. We'll keep this slide up as we go ahead and take questions. So just a reminder to everybody that you can enter questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, the bottom right corner of your screen, excuse me. We've been getting some questions throughout the presentation, so we'll go back and start addressing those. But please continue submitting questions as you have them, and we'll try to address as many as we're able to before we have to wrap up today. Okay, so just to get started, we have a question about the funding, the planning funds for the different categories. So for Category 1, the question is, can you use the $100,000 for planning purposes and the remaining $900,000 for implementation? I think generally speaking, what this is asking is, if you don't use all of the planning funds for planning, do those funds roll over for implementation? And the answer is yes, they would roll over to implementation. However, we encourage you to plan your program with enough time and enough resources to complete your planning period to ensure that you have a very smooth transition into your implementation period. Andre, I just want to check in with you if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Nothing else to add, Ronin. I think you adequately responded to that inquiry.
Awesome. So regarding the minimum number served, we had a few questions about whether the minimum number served, which is 75 for Category 2 or 150 for Category 1, whether that's serving all of those individuals at once, annually, or over the course of the whole project period. So that number is for over the course of the project period. So if you're applying in Category 2, you will be required to serve a minimum of 75 people over the course of the 36-month project period. You can propose to serve more, but just keep in mind that whatever number you propose to serve needs to be realistic for the availability of your target population. So looking into the prison, jail, or other facility that you're working with, ensuring that there are enough people in that facility who meet your eligibility requirements before finalizing your proposal. And the next question is, if the organization is an independent statewide organization, but part of a collaborating network of other organizations, can they apply for Category 2? And pointing out that the finances, operations, daily work are completely separate from the other organizations. If I'm understanding your situation correctly, you should be able to apply for Category 2. I would just encourage you to look closely at the requirements as they're laid out in the grant solicitation. So they say, the way the requirements are laid out, it says a qualifying applicant must have an operating budget of no more than $1 million per year, and you cannot be a chapter member or affiliate of a larger national organization that actually has some some level of oversight with your organization. So, you know, partnerships are allowed, but if you're a chapter of a larger organization, then you would need to apply under Category 1. So I do encourage you to look at the details as they're listed out in the solicitation. This question I may refer over to you, Andre. This is asking if funds can be used to serve individuals returning from federal facilities, and in particular talking about tribal members who might be returning from federal facilities. Can the funds from this Second Chance Act grant be used for that?
Yes, the individuals returning from federal facilities can be serviced when the individuals are actually returning back to their communities. However, the particular awardee or the nonprofit organization that will be conducting the work cannot use these funds to do work behind the federal wall, so within the federal institutions.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. The next question is about the partnerships with correctional agencies and law enforcement. This person asks if there is a requirement for an MOA or MOU from correctional partner as well as law enforcement. What if these are the same organization? So in their situation, the county law enforcement is responsible for the local jail. So that's very common, you know, probably a sheriff's office or a county department that oversees both law enforcement and corrections. And they're asking if they would need 2 MOUs or MOAs. If it is the same organization, I don't believe you would need 2 different agreements. I would make clear in your proposal what that's covering both. And one thing I would encourage you to think about is if in your jurisdiction there are other law enforcement agencies that it'd be important to consider partnering with, and that might also help boost your application. So if you're working with the county sheriff's office because they oversee your jail, are you also working with folks that are returning to a particular city where you'd want to partner with the city law enforcement agency or whatever the police force might be in that municipality as well? All right, next question. How do we show collaboration with an evaluator, and do we include a fee for the evaluator in our budget? I mean, I would say that showing the collaboration with your evaluator would mean in your description of the evaluator's role in your program, this was something that Andre covered in his portion, but describing what that partnership looks like, and if you have an MOU, an MOA, or any form of documentation that shows a partnership, include that in your application as well. And also just making sure to include, are there regular meetings? Are there regular communication? How do you plan to share data? Making sure all of that is included in your proposal. And then how much you're planning to spend on contracting with that evaluator. The next question is, would a state office of reentry be considered a valid partner for MOU or MOA? You could definitely partner with a state office of reentry. They wouldn't, if you're asking if they could count as a corrections partner or a law enforcement partner, unless they actually serve those functions, I would say no, they would not count for that. If you want to partner with an office of reentry as part of your program, that's definitely encouraged. It's definitely any partnerships that can enhance your program, and if you feel an MOU or MOA is appropriate to make it a stronger partnership, it's definitely encouraged. But they would have to actually have a law enforcement or correctional function to be counted as that for part of for the purposes of the requirements for this grant. And then another question about the law enforcement MOU, asking if district attorneys count. I would say no. They would, in terms of law enforcement, this would need to be a police department, a sheriff's office, state police. I know it does vary in different jurisdictions, and I think a partnership with district attorney could definitely be valuable for your program, but I don't believe it would count as your law enforcement MOU. Another question about partnerships, which I'm very happy about because partnerships are a really key part of this solicitation, asking if you need MOUs for the community partners. There is not a requirement for this grant that you need MOUs for community partners. it's definitely helpful to have documentation that you can submit as part of your proposal to demonstrate that you do have these partnerships in place. It could be less formal than an MOU, but an MOU is definitely a route you can go. The next question is whether a subrecipient, may a subrecipient be a for-profit organization that is partnering with the applicant on the proposal. So if you're asking if, as a nonprofit, you apply for the grant, can you subcontract with a for-profit organization? I'm not sure. I'm actually going to refer that over to Andre. Do you know if a for-profit organization could be a subrecipient under this grant?
Depending on the circumstances of what the for-profit will be offering and what are the services that they're going to be rendering with the clients, that will be taken into consideration. However, the for-profit organization cannot be the lead applicant for the funding.
All right, so that was what I was figuring too, but so yeah, just pay close attention to what the circumstances may be under that, under which you'd want to partner with them, but as long as they're not the lead applicant, it would probably be okay. There's a question of, can we propose to serve less than 150 people if we request less than $1 million? And so, again, I just refer you back to what the requirements are for each category. If you are applying under Category 1, you are applying for up to $1 million, and you would still need to propose to serve 150 participants minimum. If you're eligible to apply under Category 2, that's up to $500,000, and you would have to be applying to serve a minimum of 75 participants. So those minimums need to still stay in place if you're planning to apply for this grant under either category. The next question is about the baseline recidivism rate, and they're asking if that would be for the general population of the prison or for the program's participants. So it's not for your program's participants, although it could be your baseline recidivism rate can be reflective of those who would be in your program. What we encourage you to do is talk to your Department of Corrections, your local corrections agencies, law enforcement. When determining your baseline recidivism rate, it should be a rate that's used in your jurisdiction that you can then compare the recidivism of your participants. You can compare those two rates. And so, for instance, if you use a rate that the DOC in your state publishes and they say they base their recidivism off of individuals who are reconvicted within 1, 2, or 3 years of release, then that definition should align with the definition you're using, which is you should be looking at reconviction for your participants, as opposed to you measuring rearrest for your participants and the state recidivism rate looking at reconviction. So you want to make sure those definitions align. If you can get it, if you decide that your program is going to serve women only, I would recommend looking for a recidivism rate that applies to women in your state as opposed to a general one, or at least having both of those available in your proposal. Someone was asking about other reentry programs that might be in their geographic area. One thing I encourage you to do is check out the National Reentry Resource Center website, which you can get to through nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. We actually have a map, the National Criminal Justice Initiatives map, that can show you different Second Chance at Grant programs around the country. All right. So someone was asking about the budget requirement for Category 2 and whether their department would qualify. I will say that if you are a state department, so this is from a particular state, if you're a state department or state agency, you would not qualify for either category. However, you could be a subrecipient if you partner with a nonprofit agency that applies for this grant. Okay. There's a question about using funds for incentives to encourage participation in follow-up interviews for evaluation purposes. It's a great question. I would refer you to the grant solicitation where there's a section on unallowable uses. So things like gift cards, food. These are things that you cannot use grant funds for. There is also on the Office of Justice Programs website a funding resource center that provides additional information on what's allowable and what's unallowable. Typically, if it's a monetary incentive, it's not allowed, but I do encourage you to look into that, the funding resource center, for more information on that. Okay. Got a few questions here on the planning and implementation. So one person asked, given that there are planning and implementation phases, how specific should we be in the design? For example, do applicants need to identify the risk and needs assessment, or can we describe several potential instruments and then finalize after the award? Historically, it's been that you would need to, in this particular example, you would need to identify the risk and needs assessment you're planning on using. For grants like this, what's common is a lot of nonprofits partner with corrections agencies and utilize the risk and needs assessments being used by the corrections agency, use the information that they gather, and that information is shared. But I do believe you'll need to identify what that instrument is. If you plan to implement your own, you would also need to identify which one that you would be using. But I will check in with Andre on this. Andre, if a nonprofit decides they want to implement their own risk and needs assessment, could they describe several potential instruments before finalizing, and then finalize which one after they receive the award, or would that disqualify them for this, for when they apply for the award?
Potential applicants, please do not reinvent the wheel. Please do not reinvent the solicitation. It is there for you as a guide. Please work accordingly. Let's not try to write our own things. Let's not try to create our own things and then get upset when you don't get awarded the grant. Stick with what's provided to you. Follow the directions. Follow the procedures. Stick with what's given to you. If you decide to use something that is not validated, you have to use a validated risk assessment tool. Should you not use what is being provided by your local Department of Correction, then you need to set up what that cost is going to be, who's going to pay for that training, how will that training happen, who's going to do that intake, when will that intake take place, what will be the entire trajectory of that intake for the participant, when will it happen, who's going to get the scores, who's going to share the information, and then who's going to do the case planning behind it. There's a lot that goes into the discussion of implementing something new, and whether or not you'll be able to bring that inside behind the wall to the correction facility.
Awesome. Thanks, Andre. I think Andre also just made another good point that the more detail you can provide about the process for what a participant's going to go through in the program, the better. I think there will be opportunities in the planning phase to iron out details and work through any potential challenges, but coming in with a very clear design is definitely important. There's another question about law enforcement partnerships and correctional partnerships, asking if the recidivism definition must match the definition used by all the correctional agencies we work with. So this is someone who works with multiple law enforcement and correctional agencies. You don't necessarily need to have multiple baseline, you don't want to have multiple baseline recidivism rates. You want to have one primary one that you work with. So what I would recommend is, working with those correctional partners to determine which is the prevailing definition, which one applies most accurately to your population, and making sure that you do have the backup documentation for how that rate was determined, so both the definition and how they collected that information. Question about one of the priority considerations, asking what do we consider a violent offender? This is something that you should also partner with your local law enforcement agency, your local and your correctional agency to help determine. There is some additional information on that in the grant solicitation itself. And I'm just checking it right now, but I believe it's in the priority consideration section on page 9. So when determining what qualifies as a violent offense, programs should consult with local law enforcement and use the definition that aligns with the definition used by your local jurisdiction. So we know that there are different definitions in different areas, so I would encourage you to do that. All right. Question for you, Andre. Are the funds released in their entirety after the award is made, or are they released equally over a 3-year period?
Hi, everyone. We've been reiterating this over and over again, and it says it in the solicitation, and it said it in this webinar. Based on what category you apply for, you will be released funds for planning. Upon completion of your planning period, you will be transitioning to implementation. That is how the funding stream is broke down, and it's different for Category 1 as opposed to Category 2. Nothing new for Andre to say. Stick with the solicitation.
All right, thank you. All right, next question. If case management is not already a component of the program, can it be developed in the planning phase? So if you're proposing a program that is already in existence, but you want to utilize this grant to help build on that program, and if one of the ways it's going to build on that is by implementing case management, one, I think that's great. Case management is very important, and it'd be a great thing to add to your program. It can be, you can use the planning phase to help develop and flush that out, but you should have a clear idea of what the role case management is going to play in your program, what structure you propose it will take. That should be included in your proposal. All right. There's a question about random assignment. So, this is one of the priority considerations, is if you're able to partner with an independent evaluator to do random assignment. The potential applicant is asking if, since they have a multi-tiered program of different tracks, so transitional housing, education, and training, can they compare participants in the different tracks rather than use random selection? So what I would recommend is, if you already have an evaluation partner that you're planning on going in to this proposal with, partnering with them and determining the best course of action for your evaluation. So the priority consideration is definitely for an independent evaluation, and where feasible, a randomized controlled trial. If that doesn't quite make sense for your model, but you still propose a independent evaluation that's a rigorous study, but not quite random assignment, but you're comparing across different tracks, if that's what works best for you, I just encourage you to partner with your evaluator to determine the best way to present that in your proposal. All right. Moving along here. A question about using grant funds for transportation, such as assistance from prison into transitional housing or assistance getting to work. In terms of if you could use funds to, as staff, assist with transportation, I believe the answer is yes. But I do refer you to the Office of Justice Programs financial guide at their Financial Resource Center for more information about whether you can use it to actually support, for instance, bus fare or anything like that. There's some specific details about how federal funds can be used for transportation in that way. But I'll check in with Andre. Anything else that you'd want to add to that around how funds could be used around transportation?
Nothing to add, Ronnie. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question around ties into the evaluation piece. So if we must track participants for 12 months after release, do we need to stop enrolling new participants as of a year before the grant ends, so we can track them to the end of the grant period? So ideally, you would have a program. Ideally, the program would be able to continue even after the grant ends. So no, you're not required to stop enrolling participants at that point. The expectation is that you'd be able to continue serving participants throughout the course of the grant. As you work with your evaluator to determine what is needed to complete the evaluation, that's where you can discuss the timelines of serving, how many people you're able to serve in the final 6 months to a year of your grant. But the expectation is that you would continue serving people through the end of the grant. Someone was asking if we could confirm if this is only available for nonprofit organizations? And the answer is yes. This grant is only available to nonprofit organizations, but that does include tribal nonprofits and tribal government. So nonprofit organizations, tribal nonprofit organizations, and federally recognized Indian tribal government. All right, question for you, Andre. Someone was asking how much will the track record of the organization be weighted in the application? How much experience doing this work is expected, and how do you demonstrate the needed level of experience?
I believe the track record of the nonprofit providing services will be demonstrated by the partnerships. There is a requirement for a partnership through an MOU or MOA with corrections, separately with law enforcement, and as well as offering, maybe you could be subcontracting with other partners that are doing this work. So I believe that that will play a role in the demonstration. Otherwise, if you feel like that you're ready to take on this magnitude of work, then by all means, submit an application according to the guidelines of the solicitation.
Okay, thank you. So another question around target population. The applicant is asked to submit the number of persons in the target population served in the past 6 months. Can that number reflect the number of men served by all partners or just the primary applicant? So this depends on the design of your program. If the primary applicant is in a partnership with these other organizations and you've been running the program for a while and you're using this grant to either continue or build on it, then you'd want to be counting the individuals who were served by that program that all the partners are involved in over the last 6 months. If you're proposing a new program through this grant, or what is effectively a new program, then you'd want to go with the other option, which I will find really quick. Okay, so if this is for, if you're implementing a new program or what is effectively a new program, the applicant must state how many people met the target population characteristics within the past 6 months. So if you're bringing together a number of partners who have been doing this work for a while, but what they're going to be doing in this grant program, if you're awarded the grant, is essentially a new program, new partnership, then you'd want to look at how many people meet your target population requirements over the past 6 months. Are grants available to a newly established nonprofit organization that's less than a year old? Technically, yes, as long as you meet the eligibility requirements under Category 1 or 2, but also keeping in mind demonstrating a history of doing this work. And so if you're a new non-for-profit but you grew out of a different non-for-profit or are an offshoot of another organization, I would just make sure that that's included in your description of your history doing this work. All right. A question about temporary housing. Can any of the funds be used to provide temporary housing? So again, just referring you to the Financial Resource Center, OJP's Financial Resource Center, to get clarification on the specifics around using funds for whether it's rent or temporary housing or some other type of housing service. But Andre, I just want to double check with you any additional context on whether funds can be used to provide temporary housing.
You cannot pay for people you cannot pay the rent for people, but I would defer that you look at the OJP financial guide.
Okay, thank you. All right, just looking through, we've got some repeat or similar questions here, so let's see what we haven't covered yet. So nonprofit if we are a nonprofit who plans to apply, but organization's operating budget is more than $1 million. So again, qualifications for this grant, if your operating budget is over $1 million, you do qualify to apply under Category 1. If your operating budget is less than $1 million, you qualify to apply under Category 2. Another question about costs. Are disallowable costs such as incentives and paying for rent disallowed as part of the program plan altogether, or simply not able to be funded by this particular grant? It is the latter. So you can't use grant funds for those disallowable costs. However, if you do have other partnerships and funding coming in from other sources where it is allowable, you may use those funds to pay for those. It's just you need to demonstrate that the funds coming from this particular grant will not be used for those services or whatever the case may be that's being funded. A question about whether you can work with individuals who are in work release if it's considered to be prior to release, if work release in our community is considered under correctional control. It's a complicated question, I think, with your, depending on your correctional system, if they are in if it is considered a correctional facility and it is a locked facility, I believe that would still qualify. If it's the type of work release where people are free to come and go, I don't know that would still qualify. Under the target population, they must be incarcerated in a state, local, or tribal prison or jail at the time of enrollment in the program. So I would just refer you back to the solicitation and look at the dynamics in your jurisdiction to see if that work release center would meet those qualifications.
Ronnie, can I jump in?
Oh, absolutely.
And I want to add to that is that, so if you're trying to say that the work release center qualifies as corrections, then I would argue, what about the participants? Are they the highest risk measured in the risk of need assessment? It is unlikely. I'll stop there. Again, people, let's stick with the solicitation.
No, I think that's a really good point. So when thinking about your whole proposal, think about it as a whole proposal. So if you're looking at a work release center, are these individuals that would be identified on a criminogenic risk assessment as being medium to high risk to recidivate? So thinking about it holistically, keeping all of those factors in mind when determining your program design. Okay. Can this grant be used to expand program and capacity of an existing program? So yes, if you can use this grant to build on an existing program, but I do encourage you to look at the solicitation. In particular, I think it was page 8 we were talking about before that gives you some additional guidelines about what you would need to demonstrate when building on an existing program. Another question, can you limit services to a particular type of violent crime such as domestic violence? And so when you're looking at your target population, you are allowed to select a specific subset of people who meet the baseline requirements. So the base requirements are medium to high risk as identified using a validated assessment tool. They have to be 18 or older and convicted as adults and incarcerated in a state, local, or tribal prison or jail at the time of enrollment. If you want to then focus in on a particular subset of that population, that is allowed. But again, I encourage you to make sure that there are enough people to meet the minimum requirement for applying for the grant. Okay. Someone was just asking for organizational budget limits again. Just as a reminder, Category 1, anyone who is a nonprofit organization, tribal nonprofit, or federally recognized tribal government can apply. For Category 2, you must have an operating budget under $1 million per year, and you cannot be a chapter member or affiliate of a larger national organization. Question about a stipend for hard skills training course, whether that would be an allowable expense. If it's money being provided to the individual, the answer is no. I don't believe that's an allowable expense. Someone just wanted to confirm that there was a question before about whether a district attorney's office would count as a law enforcement agency for the purposes of this grant, and no, it would not, just to confirm. So when we're talking about law enforcement for this grant, we're talking about police departments, sheriff's offices, state police, that sort of law enforcement. However, again, partnering with a district attorney's office is allowed if you feel it will enhance the program. There's definitely been some valuable partnerships with DA offices with previous grants. Okay, we have some repeat questions here, so just moving through. A question about the target population and whether incarcerated means sentenced, or if these individuals are held during pretrial hearings and then released, could they still have been enrolled prior to release? There is a requirement that they be convicted as adults. So they may not be sentenced yet, but they do need to be convicted. So if you began your pre-release services prior to sentencing, that would technically be allowed. There's a question about the partnership with law enforcement, and if they're partnering with a state corrections facility and individuals are being released statewide, who would be the appropriate law enforcement agency to partner with? So something to keep in mind there, and as Andre and I were mentioning before, kind of thinking about your whole program holistically, where are your participants being released to? If you're not focusing in on a particular jurisdiction, but you're providing post-release services and post-release case management to individuals, what are the jurisdictions where you're going to be providing that support, and then going to those jurisdictions to partner with law enforcement. For instance, if you have a lot of individuals, or you believe the majority of your individuals are going to return to one particular jurisdiction, you might want to partner with that law enforcement agency, but utilize that partnership to also learn about what what might be other considerations in other areas. You are welcome to partner with multiple law enforcement agencies, but I would just keep that in mind. You'll be providing post-release services to these individuals in the community, and bringing in a law enforcement agency to provide some support on that would be helpful. Also, just if you are working statewide, utilizing a statewide law enforcement agency that might have some input in how you're defining violent offender, for instance, or how you're coming up with your baseline recidivism rate is another thing to consider there. Okay. So there's a question about whether a drug and alcohol nonprofit can apply for this grant. So yes, technically, if you're a nonprofit agency, you meet those other requirements, you can apply. You just want to keep in mind that in the past we've had other grants available that focus on mental health and substance use disorders, so that's something to keep an eye out for. But a nonprofit agency that provides treatment services would be eligible. Okay. So there's a question about whether there's any guidance about the use of individual contractors, not subcontracts with programs, in the development of the planning phase or the delivery of program services. As far as I know, we don't have any direct guidance around that, but Andre, just checking with you, the question is there any guidance about the use of individual contractors in the development of the planning phase or the delivery of program services?
Applicants, please be advised that we're asking you to provide evidence-based training. Therefore, if you are recommending that an individual be contracted with, then please provide those credentials that will qualify the person to perform the certifications or the training or the cognitive therapy or whatever you are proposing that the individual or the role the individual will play in the program.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about whether there are pre- and post-release components to this grant. At a minimum, your pre-release for this program needs to include enrollment and screening and assessment for individuals. And then post-release is where you absolutely need to have other support services such as case management, transition planning, whatever other wraparound services that your program proposes to provide. Definitely needs to be happening post-release. While pre-release, the requirement is, screening and assessment for the eligible population. We do know that strong programs are the ones that are able to begin services inside and develop transition plans to work with folks as they transition to post-release, so just keeping that in mind. And just echoing something that Andre mentioned before too about looking into what evidence-based services are in place. If you have a partnership with your corrections agency, we encourage you to work with them to determine what's happening inside so your program can complement those services. So one of the requirements for the grant is, I'm just going to find which page it is on to direct you, page 7 and 8, talks about cognitive-based programming and asks applicants to clearly document the evidence-based, cognitive-based programming that will be used to address criminogenic risk and needs pre- and post-release. So you may not necessarily be the ones who provide that pre-release, but you should be discussing with your correctional partner or other partners that are working inside the facility to determine if there are any cognitive-based treatments happening inside that your program can build on or complement. There's a question of, if awarded funding under this grant, would that preclude further awards from the Office of Justice Programs for other projects? I'm going to refer that over to Andre.
So is the potential applicant asking whether or not, if they're included on other SCA applications, does that preclude them from applying directly for this particular funding? Is that what the question?
I think the question is, if they apply for this funding and they get the grant, would that mean they couldn't apply for other awards?
No, it doesn't preclude you from applying for other awards. The thing is that this would be the award that would support that particular program. However, we do cross-reference with Department of Labor and Department of Education on many of the other initiatives that are very similar to many of the proposals or functions or actual programmatic efforts that could be done under this particular program. So we do reach across the line to the Office for Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. We go across with the National Institute of Justice, and as we're looking at other agencies like Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, and Department of Education. There's a cross-reference there.
Great, thank you. There's a question about whether you can partner with organizations that are outside the state you're working in. The answer is yes. I mean, a lot of programs actually, their evaluator might be based in another state, so that does happen. But again, you just want to make sure you document and clearly show what they're contributing to the program. So an evaluator makes sense. They may not necessarily need to be around as often as another partner, although when it comes to an evaluator, we definitely encourage you to have them be heavily involved from the very beginning. But if you're talking about a treatment provider who's based in another state but has offices or program sites in your state, that would be allowable. But again, just to clearly identify what their role would be and making sure that it is contributing to the goals of the program. The next question is, does the planning phase have to span 12 months? Can that phase be less than that period of time? While there are instances where programs are able to complete the planning phase before that 12-month period is up, we encourage you to really plan to use that entire 12-month period, especially if it's a new program that you're proposing. there are a lot of hiccups when grants are first awarded. Contract doesn't go through or is delayed with one of your partners. Sometimes the space you were hoping for ends up not coming through and you need to wait for new space to open up. A lot of issues pop up, so I would definitely encourage you to utilize in your plan that whole 12-month period. All right. Okay, we got a couple new questions that just popped up here. So there's a question about the research. This question is, our interpretation is the activity being conducted related to control groups and evaluations is to comply with GPRA or OJP requirements for performance measures and not for the purpose of developing or contributing to generalizable knowledge. So actually, when conducting research, if you want to conduct research as part of this grant program and you're going for that particular priority consideration, you would, one, there is guidance on what research entails, and so I encourage you to go to the Office of Justice Programs website to learn more about that. But there, you would still need to go through the IRB process. You would still need to go through all of the hoops to complete research. But there are programs in the past that have gotten grants similar to these that it does contribute to generalizable knowledge, and it is a publishable evaluation report. Okay, for how long, this is the next question, for how long are pre-release services expected to be given? I understand that post-release case management that is expected to be sustained over a period of at least 6 months. I don't believe there's actually a defined period of time for the pre-release component, but I'm going to just do a quick double check. But Andre, do you know if there's a defined pre-release period of time?
No definitive pre-release time.
Okay, I didn't think there was. Yeah, so there's no defined time for that. And again, just like we said before, if there are services being provided by one of your partnering agencies, including corrections, then I would just keep that in mind for how your program is going to build off of what they're doing. There's a question about whether this can be a multi-state plan. For example, we have chapters that do training in multiple states. So I'm guessing they're asking if their program can actually serve multiple jurisdictions, which is a new consideration for me. Andre, is that have you heard of that before, and is that allowable?
It doesn't sound realistic. I think, again, we're sticking with jurisdictions as they're decided by the Department of Correction, and this is about a pipeline. This is about a pipeline regarding individuals who are incarcerated and their transitional efforts as they return. It is not to be morphed into your organization as assigned. It's for your organization, nonprofit, to fit within the needs of individuals who are returning from prison, from jail, from incarceration to the community.
Great, thank you. The next question is around the target population again. So is it okay if you only serve medium risk participants, or is there a requirement to serve a number of both? So just to kind of reiterate the requirements for target population, they must be medium to high risk. So there's not a ratio for how many of each you need to serve. You just, the goal is to serve those who are at greatest risk to recidivate and who have the greatest need. So keep that in mind, and then also note that in the priority considerations, there is a priority consideration to focus in on high-risk populations. So if you're not focusing on high-risk populations who have a history of violent offenses, your program should be documenting how you're going to serve medium and high-risk individuals.
Hi, Ronin. I want to jump in here and kind of inform all the applicants that this is the most highly competitive grant under Second Chance Act. And should you decide to stick with the guidelines that are identified as a solicitation, then you will quickly meet the needs, and then it becomes about your program design. However, should you decide to deviate from what has already been provided for you in this particularly highly competitive market, then that puts you in a certain situation. And so, again, I want to encourage everyone to thoroughly read the solicitation, to thoroughly go through the webinar, to understand why we're referring you to the solicitation, the OJB Financial Guide. It is custom that individuals are prone to do what they want, but there's a need and there's things that are mandated by law and through a statute. So we're encouraging you to build a program within the constraints of what has been provided to you through the solicitation.
Great, thank you, Andre. There are a couple questions about residential reentry centers and residential reentry centers and whether you can serve those individuals who are held in residential reentry centers as part of considering that as pre-release. And I'm gonna refer this to Andre, but I'll just note that those look different in different states, and it can, sometimes those are really more integrated in the community in some states, in which case it really wouldn't necessarily qualify. But Andre, any comments on serving individuals in residential reentry centers considering that to be the pre-release component?
Well, there's nothing in the solicitation that precludes you, but considering that you can find violent offenders there, considering that you can find the most medium to high risk as identified through a risk assessment, validated risk assessment instrument, considering that you can find individuals or participants there that meet the priority for high risk. You're talking to correctional experts, Ronian and I here. So considering that those persons are at the residential area, which I don't know, we've been around for a long time, Ronian. Just wanted to be. I understand that we're looking to, as they say, search for or reach for the low-hanging fruit. But this particular solicitation is provoking you to do some of the things that, are a bit unusual, to go after to assist violent offenders, to work with law enforcement. So it's not business as usual, folks.
Well, and so I just want to reiterate, too, that this idea of thinking about your proposal as a whole. And so we've definitely seen proposals and programs in the past that have worked in residential reentry centers where the individuals who are assigned there are low risk, sometimes medium risk to recidivate. And so just keeping that in mind, do the folks in those facilities that you are considering working in, do they meet the other eligibility criteria for this grant? And deciding whether that still fulfills what the grant's trying to accomplish. And speaking of risk, there was this question about whether high risk is only used to identify the level of violence, or is high risk used to identify recidivism, which could result from medium risk offensive, the high risk of recidivism. So the answer is high risk of recidivism, medium to high risk of recidivism. This is a criminogenic risk that should be assessed and determined using a validated risk assessment. Many corrections agencies already have a tool that they use, but I definitely encourage you to work with your corrections partner or other reentry partners to determine, what assessment is being used, or if you need to use an assessment to determine that risk level. But it is medium to high risk of recidivism. And just to comment again on that priority consideration, the priority consideration is still talking about people who are high risk, but it's those people who are high risk and have having a violent offense background. So that's not a requirement for the grant, but if it is one of the priority considerations that you can focus in on that population. And there was another question about population and whether there's an age requirement beyond 18 and over. And this person's asking, can a program serve only up to age 26? If that's in the parameters of the existing program, that is fine. Just to reiterate, you are required to serve a specific subset of people who are medium to high risk to recidivate based on a validated assessment tool, 18 or older and convicted as adults, and incarcerated in a state, local, or tribal prison or jail at the time of enrollment. And so if you decide that the greatest need in your area is with an 18 to 26-year-old population that meets those other requirements, then that's fine. There's definitely a big push around that young adult population. But just keeping in mind that they still have had to have been convicted as adults, they still need to score medium to high risk on a validated risk assessment, risk of recidivism. There have been a number of questions just about where to access the solicitation and guidance for this grant. So we posted the link in the chat box, but we'll also, when the webinar is posted on our website, when the webinar is posted on our website, we'll also have a link to the solicitation there. Excuse me. All right. Okay, so this is a question about there's an organization that's already providing vocational training through a state-funded program within both pre and post-release. And they're asking if they can apply for this grant, or do they overlap more than allowable. One thing to keep in mind is you definitely want to avoid using one grant to report on outcomes for another grant. However, if you build a program with this grant that complements that other grant, that is allowable. But again, you don't want to use another grant and report on those outcomes as outcomes for this grant. I know that's a little confusing, but we definitely encourage partnerships with other programs. If you have a vocational training that individuals from this program are able to take part in, that's great, as long as you can clearly differentiate between what the two different grants are funding and how you're reporting on those outcomes. So there's a question about research around, there's an OJP decision tree. They were reviewing the OJP decision tree. If the activity being conducted is only to comply with OJP requirements for performance measures, then the activity is not considered research. If it isn't research, IRB is not required. They're asking if that's the case, and that is the case. You don't need an IRB if you're simply meeting the performance measures of the grant, but we do encourage you to consider doing more than just meeting those baseline performance measures. As we've discussed, there's a priority consideration to do an independent evaluation and to conduct research, and doing those types of evaluations on programs like this can show us what's working, what's effective, and how to improve these programs going forward. All right. A question about will faith-based providers be considered as evidence-based providers if they have a measurable success method for tracking outcomes? When we're talking about evidence-based, we're talking about evidence-based interventions, evidence-based services. So faith-based providers are absolutely eligible to apply for the grants. If you are implementing a particular intervention or service that has been evaluated, published on, if it's registered in the National Registry of Evidence-Based Practices or another registry of evidence-based services, then that would be considered evidence-based. The provider themselves would not necessarily be considered evidence-based, but it's about the interventions and the services being provided. Okay, so we're winding down here, just checking to see if there's any other questions. Okay, so there's a question here about the MOU. This is an interesting one, Andre. They're asking if they can meet the MOU requirement by partnering with an agency that has an existing MOU with law enforcement and corrections. So basically saying the lead applicant wouldn't have it, but one of their partners would. I believe the lead applicant still needs to have the MOU with the law enforcement or corrections agency, as opposed to having an MOU with an agency that has an MOU with those agencies. But I'm just going to turn to Andre to confirm that.
The MOU should speak specifically to this particular program. The program that you are writing about or hoping to initiate, that's what the MOU should speak to. And the lead applicant should be the signatory on the MOU or MOA.
Perfect. And yeah, I think that's an important point, is that your MOU should speak to this program. So if they have an existing partnership, does their MOU actually speak to what this program is going to do? And if you're the lead applicant, there may be something different happening in this program. So keep that in mind, that the MOU should really speak to what this program is trying to accomplish. Okay, so a question about whether new organizations will be able to apply for this grant. Yes, it's something we covered before. Yes, you would be eligible, but just keep in mind you do need to demonstrate some experience in this area. So whether you're an offshoot of an old organization or staff at this organization are coming from an organization with background in this, that is a part of the application process. So there's a question about the evaluation and whether the evaluation team, can we use an evaluation team that is a part of the applicant agency, not the higher level independent evaluation that receives priority consideration? So you kind of covered it in your own question there. If you're seeking the priority consideration, it needs to be an independent evaluator, not part of your agency. If you are, if you need to just use an evaluator to help with performance measures and evaluating some processes, it technically could be part of your own agency. We definitely encourage you to explore options to kind of bolster your performance, your outcome measurement, your performance measurement by bringing in kind of some outside eyes to assist with that. Okay. All right, checking our chat box here just to make sure I didn't miss anything in the other section before we wrap up. This is a question about if an organization is applying to do an evaluation as part of their grant. And then I think we might have to wrap up after this. But the question is, if they're structuring an RCT that provides a full range of services to treatment and group and a limited range to the control group, can the total number that's being served be 150, with 75 in the treatment group and 75 in the control group, or does it need to be 150 in both? Andre, I don't think it's specified that you would need to break it up. That you need to have 150 in control and 150 in treatment, but I'm going to check in with you about that.
150 refers to how many participants are supposed to serve under this particular program. As it relates to the evaluation design, that should be a part of the design that is determined by your independent evaluator, especially if you're looking to do an RCT.
Okay, yeah, so definitely bring in your evaluator to have that conversation, but 150 people need to be served by this grant. So I would work with your evaluator to determine what your control group would need to look like in that situation. Okay, just do a quick check, make sure. I'm sure there are some questions that we may have missed just because of the way that they come in. So one thing I will say is, as you can see, our contact information is posted on this slide. And once we post the slides, you'll also see the contact information for grants.gov, which can also answer some questions, and the NCJRS. But I'll just double check. I think we may be able to fit one more in here if I see if I missed any. No, I think. Nope, I think we're okay. I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure we may have missed some, so I definitely encourage you to reach out to the emails on the screen or to Office of Justice Programs. But we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar for today. Am I going to the next slide? Yeah. So one thing I just want to remind everybody to do is to sign up for our newsletter, csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. That's where you by subscribing to that, you get announcements about webinars like this. You also hear about funding opportunities. So as grants become available by the Office of Justice Programs, we do send those out, and just latest resources and information about reentry. A reminder that the grants.gov information and the National Criminal Justice Reference Service Response Center, NCJRS, the contact information will be posted on our website with the slides and the recording when those get posted. So thank you everyone for joining us. The recording and the PDF will be, that were used today will be posted on our website. That's nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. And as I said, please sign up for the newsletter to keep updated on latest reentry news. So thank you again to Andre for taking the time to present today, and thank you to Jan for also presenting, and thank you to all of you for joining us and for asking your questions, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.